The Sunday pot roast dinner had been a family tradition for 23 years. Every week, same time, same table, same disappointed looks directed at me across the mashed potatoes. This particular Sunday in March, I was cutting into my roast when Dad launched into his familiar refrain. 20 years, he said, shaking his head as he reached for the gravy. 20 years since college and you're still chasing fantasies. My mother nodded in solemn agreement, her expression suggesting she was attending a funeral rather than a family dinner. We don't even know what to tell the neighbors anymore, Michael. When they ask what you do for work, I tell them you work with documentaries, Dad continued, the word documentaries dripping with disdain. But that's being generous. What you actually do is follow strangers around with a camera, hoping someone will pay you for it. I swallowed my bite of pot roast and nodded. That's certainly one way to describe it. My younger brother Kevin, who'd driven over from his suburban house with his wife and 2 kids, joined the familiar chorus. Mike, you're 39. Don't you think it's time to consider something more stable? I could get you an interview at my firm. Insurance sales isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills. Insurance sales, Mom repeated approvingly. Now that's a real career. Benefits, 401k, security. I'd heard variations of this conversation every Sunday for the past 15 years. Ever since I'd graduated from Northwestern with a degree in journalism and decided to pursue documentary filmmaking instead of taking the entry-level reporter position at the local newspaper that my parents had arranged for me. In their world, success meant a steady paycheck, health insurance, and a predictable career trajectory. In their world, following your passion was a luxury that people outgrew by 30, like sleeping until noon or wearing band t-shirts. What they didn't understand, what I'd given up trying to explain years ago, was that I wasn't chasing fantasies. I was building something. Slowly, methodically, one film at a time. The thing is, Dad continued, warming to his favorite theme, documentary filmmaking isn't a real job. It's a hobby that some people manage to get paid for occasionally. But you can't build a life on occasionally. Kevin's wife Sarah chimed in helpfully. Kevin's company has great benefits. Full medical, dental, vision. Plus they match 401k contributions up to 6%. 6%, Mom repeated reverently as if Sarah had just quoted scripture. I took another bite of pot roast. The meat was perfectly tender, the gravy rich and savory. Mom might not understand my career, but she could definitely cook. You know what bothers me most? Dad was building toward his closing argument, the one he delivered at least twice a month. You have real talent. Your college professor said so. You could have been a journalist at a major newspaper by now. Instead, you're living in that cramped apartment, driving a 10-year-old car, wasting your intelligence on projects that go nowhere. 20 years and still a failure, he concluded with the satisfaction of a prosecutor resting his case. Mom added her own closing statement. We're ashamed to tell people what you do. The words hung in the air above the dinner table like incense at a particularly depressing church service. I looked around at my family. Dad in his golf shirt and khakis, Mom in her Sunday best, Kevin and Sarah representing the suburban ideal with their matching wedding rings and carefully coordinated outfits. Their disappointment in me was so familiar it had become comfortable, like an old sweater that didn't fit properly but was too worn to throw away. I understand your concerns, I replied, the same response I'd been giving for years. The truth was more complicated. Over the past 20 years I'd made 7 full-length documentaries. 2 had won awards at film festivals. 3 had been picked up by streaming services. 1 had aired on PBS and been nominated for an Emmy. The most recent one, about corruption in youth sports leagues, had been acquired by Netflix and was currently trending in the top 10. But explaining this to my family was like trying to describe color to someone who'd been blind since birth. They had no framework for understanding a career that didn't follow traditional corporate hierarchies or provide predictable monthly paychecks. Michael, Mom said, leaning forward with the expression she used when delivering particularly important wisdom, it's not too late. You're still young enough to start over. Kevin's firm is always looking for good people. Kevin nodded enthusiastically. The training is only 6 weeks. You'd start at $45,000 base salary plus commission. With your communication skills, you could probably make $60,000 or $70,000 your first year. $60,000 or $70,000. The Netflix deal alone had been worth more than that, but there was no point in mentioning it. They'd either not believe me or find some way to diminish it. That's very generous of you to think of me, I said instead. Dad set down his fork with a decisive clink. The problem, Michael, is that you've always been too proud to accept help. Too stubborn to admit when something isn't working. 20 years of evidence, Mom added. At some point you have to face reality. Reality. As if the life I'd built wasn't real because it didn't resemble their definition of success. I was about to respond when my phone rang. In the Hamilton household, phones were silenced during Sunday dinner. It was one of Mom's unbreakable rules, right up there with no elbows on the table and always finishing what's on your plate. But I'd forgotten to turn off my ringer, and the sound cut through the conversation like a fire alarm. Sorry, I said, reaching for the phone. I'll just turn it off. But when I saw the caller ID I paused. CBS News. Specifically, the 60 Minutes production office. I looked around the table at my family, all staring at me with expressions ranging from irritated to disappointed. My phone continued ringing. You know what? I said, making a decision that would change everything. I should probably take this. Dad's eyebrows shot up. During dinner? Michael, that's incredibly rude. It's work, I replied, swiping to answer. This is Michael. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and loud enough that everyone at the table could hear clearly. Mr. Hamilton, this is Janet Rodriguez from 60 Minutes. I'm calling to confirm our interview tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We want to make sure you're comfortable with the questions we'll be covering about your documentary work and the impact it's had on youth sports reform. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My family's faces went through a series of rapid changes. Confusion. Recognition. I cleared my throat. Yes, that works fine. Should I come to your Manhattan offices, or are you setting up somewhere else? We'll be filming at your apartment as discussed. Anderson Cooper will be conducting the interview. We expect about 2 hours for the full segment, though obviously only a portion will air. Anderson Cooper. The grandfather clock seemed to be ticking louder. Perfect, I replied, my voice steady despite the fact that my father's fork had literally slipped from his fingers and clattered onto his plate. I'll see you at 9. Excellent. And Mr. Hamilton? Congratulations again on the Netflix success. The impact your documentary is having on youth sports policy is remarkable. We're looking forward to discussing it. I thanked her and hung up. The silence stretched on. And on. Finally, Kevin found his voice. Did she just say 60 Minutes? And Anderson Cooper, Sarah added weakly. I set my phone on the table and picked up my fork. Anyone want to pass the green beans? Dad was staring at me like I'd just announced I was an alien from Mars. Michael, what documentary was she talking about? The youth sports one. It's called Game Over: How Adults Destroy Kids' Sports. It came out 6 months ago. And it's on Netflix? Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. It's been in the top 10 documentaries for the past 3 weeks. More silence. Kevin's 2 young children, who'd been coloring quietly at the end of the table, continued their artwork, blissfully unaware that the adult world around them had suddenly shifted on its axis. But Dad struggled for words. You never said, we had no idea. You never asked, I replied simply. When I mentioned I was working on a documentary about youth sports, you said it sounded boring and changed the subject. The truth of that statement hit the table like a physical blow. Mom's hand went to her throat. 60 Minutes wants to interview you about your work? Apparently so. Kevin was pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. Game Over. Let me look this up. As he searched, the silence continued. I took another bite of pot roast, genuinely enjoying the meal despite the tension crackling around the table like electricity before a storm. Holy shit, Kevin breathed, then immediately looked at his children. Sorry honey, Daddy said a bad word. But Mike, there are articles about you everywhere. NPR, The Washington Post, ESPN. He kept scrolling, his expression growing more stunned with each search result. It says here that your documentary has led to policy changes in youth sports leagues across 12 states. That you exposed a network of coaches who were taking bribes to manipulate game outcomes. That 3 people have been arrested based on evidence in your film. Dad reached for Kevin's phone with shaking hands. Let me see that. As my family passed the phone around, reading article after article about my work, I continued eating dinner. The pot roast really was excellent. Michael, Mom said finally, her voice strange and small, why didn't you tell us about any of this? I set down my fork and looked at her. Really looked at her. The woman who had raised me, loved me, worried about me, and spent 15 years telling me I was a failure. Mom, 3 months ago when I mentioned I was working on this project, do you remember what you said? She shook her head, though I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to remember. You said, Michael, honey, maybe it's time to stop playing with cameras and find something that actually matters. The words fell into silence. And Dad, I continued, when I told you I'd gotten funding for the project, you said it was just another excuse to avoid getting a real job. Dad's face had gone completely white. We didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Every time I tried to explain what I was working on, you either dismissed it or suggested I do something else instead. Kevin was still scrolling through search results. Mike, there are dozens of articles here. Reviews calling your work groundbreaking and essential viewing. How long has this been going on? Which part? The recognition? About 2 years. The work itself? 20 years, like Dad said. Sarah, who had been quiet through most of this, finally spoke. Michael, if you're this successful, why do you live so simply? The small apartment, the old car. It was a fair question and one that got to the heart of our family's confusion. Because I don't need much space or fancy things. I travel for work constantly. When I'm home, I'm usually editing, which means I need a quiet place with good equipment, not a big house. The car is reliable and paid for. Why would I spend money on status symbols when I could use it to fund my next project? But the money. Dad's voice trailed off. What about it? If you're making good money, why didn't you tell us? The question hung in the air, loaded with 20 years of history. Because every conversation we've had about my career for the past 15 years has been you telling me what was wrong with it and what I should do instead. When someone consistently dismisses your work as worthless, you stop sharing the details. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and nearly laughed out loud. What is it? Mom asked anxiously. A text from my agent. Apparently, after the 60 Minutes interview airs, I'm supposed to do interviews with Good Morning America and The Daily Show. Kevin's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The Daily Show? With Trevor Noah? Jon Stewart's back, actually. But yes. The silence returned, heavier than before. Finally, Dad found his voice. Michael, I owe you an apology. We all do. We had no idea you were this successful. Define successful. The question stopped him cold. Well, the recognition, the awards, the media attention. Those are nice, I agreed. But they're not why I do the work. I make documentaries because I think storytelling can change things. This youth sports film has led to policy reforms that will protect thousands of kids from exploitation. That matters more to me than any amount of media coverage. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Honey, we're proud of you. We wish we had known. You could have known. I tried to tell you many times. But every time I mentioned my work, you'd either change the subject or suggest I do something else instead. The weight of that statement settled over the table like fog. Kevin was still reading articles on his phone. Mike, it says here that you've been working on this particular investigation for 3 years. That you went undercover to multiple youth sports events, interviewed hundreds of families, compiled evidence that led to arrests. That's correct. And we knew none of this? What you knew was that I was following people around with a camera, as Dad put it. Dad winced as if I'd slapped him. Sarah leaned forward. Michael, can I ask you something honestly? I nodded. How did it feel listening to us criticize your career all these years, when you knew you were actually successful? It was the first time anyone had asked about my experience, rather than focusing on their own embarrassment. Frustrating, I answered honestly. But also clarifying. It helped me understand that your approval was based on your definitions of success, not on the actual value or impact of the work I was doing. Mom's eyes filled with tears. We made you feel like a failure. You told me I was a failure. Repeatedly. For years. The distinction was important and I could see it landing. But you weren't, Dad protested. You were successful all along. Yes. But your respect for me shouldn't depend on external recognition. It should be based on the fact that I'm your son, working hard at something I believe in, trying to make a positive impact in the world. The truth of that statement was undeniable and devastating. My phone rang again. This time I recognized the number of a journalist from the New York Times who'd been trying to reach me for weeks. Another interview? Mom asked weakly. Probably. I answered the call. This is Michael. Mr. Hamilton, this is David Chin from the Times. I know you're busy, but I wanted to confirm our interview for Wednesday. We're doing a feature on documentary filmmakers who are driving social change, and your youth sports investigation is a perfect example of how independent media can create real-world impact. I could feel my family hanging on every word. Wednesday works fine, I replied. 2 o'clock, right? Perfect. And congratulations on the Emmy nomination, by the way. Even if you don't win, the nomination itself is a significant recognition of your work's importance. Emmy nomination. I'd forgotten I hadn't mentioned that part yet. Thank you, I said. I'll see you Wednesday. When I hung up, the silence was absolute. Emmy nomination? Kevin's voice cracked slightly. Outstanding investigative documentary. The ceremony is next month. Dad put his head in his hands. Michael, what have we done? It was a question I'd been asking myself for years, but hearing him ask it out loud was somehow different. You've been operating from limited information and specific assumptions about what success looks like, I replied. The same assumptions most people have. But we should have listened, Mom said, tears now flowing freely. We should have asked questions. We should have supported you instead of constantly criticizing. Should have, yes. But you didn't. And now we're here. The words were gentle but final. Kevin set down his phone and looked directly at me. Mike, I owe you a huge apology. The insurance job, the constant suggestions that you change careers. Thought I was helping. I thought I was being the responsible big brother. You thought I was irresponsible because my career didn't look like yours. Yes. And I was wrong. Completely, totally wrong. I looked around the table at my family. Dad with his head in his hands. Mom crying quietly. Kevin and Sarah staring at me like they were seeing me for the first time. The kids still coloring, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around them. The thing is, I said quietly, this recognition is nice, but it doesn't change who I was last week or last month or 5 years ago when you were telling me to give up on my dreams. I'm the same person who's been coming to these Sunday dinners, listening to you criticize my choices, for the past 15 years. The weight of that statement settled over them like a heavy blanket. How do we fix this? Dad asked, his voice muffled by his hands. You can't fix 15 years of dismissal with one apology. But you can decide how you want to move forward. My phone buzzed with another text. I glanced at it and smiled slightly. What now? Sarah asked. My agent again. Apparently, 3 streaming services are in a bidding war for my next documentary. More silence. Michael, Mom said finally, will you forgive us? Can we start over? I looked at my mother, the woman who had packed my lunches through elementary school, driven me to soccer practice, helped me with homework, loved me unconditionally until I chose a career path she didn't understand. Mom, I forgave you years ago. Forgiveness isn't the issue. The issue is respect. And respect isn't something you can just decide to give retroactively because you found out I'm more successful than you thought. The words were hard but necessary. Then what do we do? Kevin asked. You treat me like an adult whose choices you respect, even when you don't understand them. You ask questions instead of making assumptions. And you consider the possibility that success can look different from what you've always imagined. Dad finally raised his head and looked at me directly. Can you tell us about your next project? It was such a simple question, but it was the first time in years that anyone at this table had asked about my work with genuine curiosity rather than concern or criticism. It's about the opioid crisis in rural communities. I've been researching it for 8 months, interviewing families affected by addiction, investigating the pharmaceutical companies and doctors involved in overprescribing. I watched their faces as I spoke, looking for the familiar signs of dismissal or the suggestion that I should focus on something more stable instead. But this time they listened. How long will that project take? Sarah asked. Probably another year of filming, then 6 months of editing. It's a complex story with a lot of moving parts. Kevin nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like important work. Important work. Not a hobby, not a fantasy, not something I needed to give up in favor of a real career. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. You should probably answer it, Mom said. It might be important. I answered. This is Michael. Mr. Hamilton, this is Rebecca Martinez from the MacArthur Foundation. I have some exciting news to share with you. I listened as she explained that I had been selected as a MacArthur Fellow, a Genius Grant recipient, based on my documentary work and its social impact. When I hung up, my family was staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not disappointment or concern or pity, but something that looked almost like awe. The MacArthur Fellowship, I explained. It's sometimes called a Genius Grant. It comes with a $625,000 stipend over 5 years to continue my work. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This one felt like the pause between lightning and thunder, the moment when you know everything is about to change. $600,000, Dad whispered. To keep doing exactly what I'm already doing, I confirmed. Mom reached across the table and took both of my hands in hers. Michael, I am so sorry. We are so sorry. We had no idea who you really were. You had every opportunity to find out, I replied gently. You chose not to. The truth of that statement was undeniable. As I drove home from dinner that night, I thought about the conversation, the phone calls, the look of shock and shame on my family's faces when they realized how wrong they'd been about my life. It felt like vindication, but not the kind I'd imagined. There was no satisfaction in watching people who loved me realize they'd been hurting me for years. There was only sadness at the time we'd lost, the conversations we could have had, the support I might have felt if they'd taken the time to understand my work instead of dismissing it. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. Mike, I know I can't undo years of being wrong about your career. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I always have been, even when I didn't show it right. Then one from Mom. Sweetheart, I love you and I'm sorry. Can you help me understand your work better? I want to learn. And finally one from Dad. Son, you were right and I was wrong. About everything. I'm sorry it took 60 minutes for me to see it. I smiled as I pulled into my parking space at my small apartment building. The same building they'd spent years suggesting I should move out of in favor of something more impressive. Tomorrow Anderson Cooper would interview me about my work. Next week, the New York Times would publish a feature about my investigation. Next month I might win an Emmy. But tonight I was just Michael Hamilton, documentary filmmaker, going home to review my notes for tomorrow's interview and maybe call my agent back about those streaming service offers. The same person I'd been yesterday and the day before that and every day for the past 20 years. The only thing that had changed was my family's perception. And while that was nice, it wasn't why I did the work. I did the work because it mattered. Because stories had the power to change things. Because someone had to shine a light into dark corners and ask difficult questions. The recognition was gratifying. The family's newfound respect was welcome. But the work had always been enough. It always would be.